Sometimes the smallest acts of kindness can change everything. In the scorching Mojave Desert, where temperatures hit 120 degrees, a desperate mother donkey leads her two foals to a broken man's cabin. Hank Dillard, a 58-year-old cowboy, has spent the last decade hiding from his past in desert isolation. Hardened by regret and haunted by the daughter he hasn't spoken to in years, he's built walls around his heart as impenetrable as the desert itself. The weathered photograph in his wallet, a faded image of him, his late wife and young Sarah at a county fair, remains his only connection to the family he left behind. But when these three thirsty, exhausted animals arrive seeking shelter, something stirs within him that he thought dead. What begins as simple compassion, offering water and shade, becomes something profound. Can caring for these vulnerable creatures help Hank find his way back to the family he left behind? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The hand-carved wooden cross above Hank Dillard's cabin door had weathered 10 years of desert storms, its rough edges worn smooth by sand and wind. He'd whittled it during his first lonely winter here, when the silence still felt foreign and the weight of his choices pressed down like the crushing heat of summer. Now, as he stepped onto his porch in the pre-dawn darkness, the cross caught no light, just another shadow among shadows. Hank's boots hit the weathered planks with practiced quiet. At 58, his movements carried the economy of a man who'd learned to waste nothing. Not energy, not words, not hope. The Mojave stretched endlessly before him, a landscape as unforgiving as the memories he'd come here to escape. In the distance, Joshua trees raised their arms toward stars that were already fading. And somewhere in that vast emptiness, coyotes called to each other with voices that spoke of hunger and loneliness. The cabin itself told the story of a man who'd stopped caring about comfort. What had once been a weekend retreat for weekend warriors from Los Angeles had become Hank's fortress of solitude. The roof leaked in 3 places, patched with tar and good intentions. The windows were grimy with dust that no amount of cleaning could fully remove. Inside, the furniture consisted of what he'd needed to survive. A narrow bed, a table built from salvaged wood, 2 chairs, though he never had visitors, and a wood-burning stove that provided both heat and a way to cook the simple meals that sustained him. His morning routine never varied. Coffee first, black, strong enough to wake the dead, brewed in a battered pot that had seen better decades. Then a walk around the property's perimeter, checking the solar panels that powered his radio and the single bare bulb that lit his evenings. The well pump needed attention. It always needed attention. Water was life out here, and Hank treated it with the reverence others reserved for religion. He'd lost his faith the night Margaret died. The doctors had done everything modern medicine could offer, but cancer doesn't negotiate. Margaret had faced it with the same quiet strength she'd brought to their 23 years of marriage, never complaining about the treatments that made her sick or the hospital bills that ate through their savings, like acid through metal. Toward the end, when she could barely speak above a whisper, she'd made him promise to take care of Sarah, to not let grief drive him away from their daughter. He'd broken that promise within 6 months. Sarah had tried. Lord knows she'd tried. She'd called every day at first, then every week, then just on holidays and birthdays. She'd driven out to the ranch they'd owned in Barstow, the one he'd sold to pay Margaret's medical bills, trying to convince him to move closer to civilization, closer to her. But Hank had already made his choice. He'd failed as a husband, unable to save the woman he loved, and he'd be damned if he'd failed Sarah too, by burdening her with his broken pieces. The ranch had sold for less than it was worth, but enough to buy this isolated cabin and a few acres of nothing. Sarah had begged him not to go. She'd stood in the driveway, tears streaming down her face, telling him that she needed him, that they could help each other heal. But Hank had seen the future stretching ahead, years of him dragging her down with his grief, his inability to be the father she deserved. Better to make a clean break. Better to let her build a life without his shadow falling across it. That had been 10 years ago. Sarah would be 34 now, probably married, maybe with children he'd never meet. The thought should have brought pain, but Hank had learned to wall off such feelings. Pain was a luxury he couldn't afford out here, where survival demanded focus and sentiment could kill you. The desert had taught him harsh lessons. In summer, temperatures regularly climbed above 115 degrees, sometimes pushing toward 125. A man could die of dehydration in hours if he wasn't careful. In winter, the nights dropped below freezing, and the same sun that baked the earth mercilessly would disappear behind clouds, leaving the landscape gray and lifeless. Flash floods could turn dry washes into raging torrents with no warning. Rattlesnakes, scorpions, and javelinas all demanded respect, but Hank had adapted. He'd learned to read the sky for weather changes, to track the movement of water and game, to fix anything that broke with whatever materials he could scavenge or afford. His hands, once soft from office work managing the ranch's books, had grown calloused and scarred. His face, protected by a battered hat and long sleeves, had still aged years in the desert sun. He looked older than his 58 years, but he felt oddly timeless, as if the desert had scoured away everything unnecessary, leaving only the essential parts of himself. The essential parts weren't much to speak of. His days followed patterns as rigid as the changing seasons. Morning coffee and perimeter check. Maintenance work, always something needed fixing. Afternoon rest during the worst heat. Evening repairs or reading by lamplight. He owned maybe 20 books, read each one dozens of times. He had a radio that picked up stations from Las Vegas and Phoenix, but he rarely turned it on. The news was always the same. People hurting each other, politicians lying, the world spinning toward some inevitable disaster. None of it mattered out here. He'd thought about getting a dog once. The local animal shelter in Barstow was always looking for homes for strays. But pets meant responsibility, attachment, the possibility of loss. Hank had lost enough for one lifetime. The nearest neighbor was 15 miles away, a grizzled prospector named Pete, who'd been chasing gold in these hills since the Carter administration. Pete stopped by maybe 4 times a year, usually when he needed help with his truck or wanted to trade canned goods for Hank's mechanical skills. They'd drink coffee, exchange maybe 50 words total, and Pete would disappear back into the hills. It was the closest thing Hank had to a social life. Sometimes, late at night, when the desert wind moaned through the gaps in the cabin walls, Hank would remember what it felt like to belong somewhere. Margaret's laugh when he'd tell her stories about his day. Sarah's excited chatter about school friends and book reports, and the latest boy she'd developed a crush on. Family dinners where conversation flowed as easily as water, where silence was comfortable rather than oppressive. But those memories were dangerous. They reminded him of what he'd given up, what he'd lost through his own choices as much as through tragedy. Margaret's death had been beyond his control, but pushing Sarah away, that was on him. He'd convinced himself it was noble, this self-imposed exile. In reality, it was cowardice dressed up as sacrifice. The sun was climbing now, already promising another scorching day. Hank finished his coffee and set the cup beside the door where he'd find it tonight, another small ritual in a life built from rituals. He had fence wire to repair, a bearing in the windmill that needed greasing, and a dozen other tasks that would fill the hours until the heat drove him inside. Above his head, the wooden cross cast its shadow across the porch. He'd carved it with no particular faith in mind, just muscle memory from a childhood spent in Baptist pews. Now it seemed to mock him, a symbol of hope and redemption hanging over a man who'd given up on both. Sometimes he thought about taking it down, burning it in the stove with the rest of his regrets. But somehow he never did. Maybe he wasn't quite ready to abandon everything he'd once believed in. The desert stretched away in all directions, empty and endless, and exactly as unforgiving as the day he'd arrived. Hank pulled his hat low against the strengthening sun and set about the business of another day's survival. unaware that before this day ended, 3 desperate creatures would arrive at his door and change everything he thought he knew about solitude, compassion, and the possibility of second chances. The heat hit like a physical blow when Hank stepped outside at noon. The thermometer nailed to the shady side of his cabin read 118 degrees and climbing. Even the lizards had sense enough to stay hidden during hours like these. But something had driven him from the relative coolness of his cabin, a sound that didn't belong in the desert's midday silence. It came again, a low, desperate bray that spoke of exhaustion and need. Hank squinted through the heat shimmer rising from the hard-pan earth. At first, he saw nothing but the familiar landscape of creosote bush and scattered rock. Then movement caught his eye near the old cattle guard that marked the edge of his property. 3 shapes emerged from the distortion like mirages, becoming real. A mother donkey, her coat dusty grey and matted with sweat, led 2 smaller forms toward his cabin. The foals, one dark brown, the other lighter, stumbled on legs that looked too weak to carry them another step. All 3 animals moved with the careful determination of creatures who had traveled far beyond their limits. Hank's first instinct was to retreat inside, to let the desert handle this problem, as it handled all problems, with indifference and inevitable consequence. Wild donkeys weren't uncommon in this part of the Mojave. Descendants of abandoned mining stock, they'd learned to survive in conditions that would kill domestic animals. Usually, they stayed well away from human habitation, but these 3 were clearly beyond survival mode. The mother's ribs showed through her coat, and her eyes held a desperate intelligence that Hank recognized. She'd brought her babies to the only source of help for miles around, gambling everything on the kindness of a stranger. The donkey stopped 30 feet from his porch and looked directly at him. Her dark eyes held no fear, only exhaustion, and a mother's fierce determination to save her young. One of the foals swayed on its feet, and Hank could see its tongue lolling from its mouth. "Hell," he muttered, the word disappearing into the superheated air. He went back inside and filled his largest pot with water from his carefully hoarded supply. Every drop was precious out here. The well was reliable but not abundant, and the summer heat made conservation a matter of survival. But looking at those 3 desperate creatures, calculation seemed petty. When he emerged with the water, the donkeys hadn't moved. The mother watched him with the wariness of a wild thing that had learned to fear humans, but was now forced to trust one. Hank set the pot down halfway between the porch and the animals, then retreated to give them space. The mother approached first, testing each step, ready to bolt if this proved to be a trap. When she reached the water, she drank with the mechanical desperation of severe dehydration, long, steady pulls that seemed to go on forever. Only when she'd taken the edge off her thirst did she step back and call to her foals. The larger foal reached the water first, plunging its muzzle deep and drinking with the abandon of youth. The smaller one, the lighter-colored female, was clearly in worse shape. She made it to the pot, but could barely lift her head to drink. Hank found himself taking an involuntary step forward as she swayed. The mother donkey's head snapped up, ears pinned back in warning. Hank froze, hands raised in a gesture he hoped she'd understand. After a long moment, she seemed to decide he posed no immediate threat and went back to watching her babies drink. The galvanized water trough sat in a shed behind his cabin, gathering dust and rust in equal measure. Hank hadn't thought about it in years. A relic from the cabin's previous life, as a weekend retreat for people who'd had grander plans than survival. Now he found himself calculating. The trough would hold maybe 50 gallons. He could spare that much water, couldn't he? What was he thinking? These weren't pets. They were wild animals that belonged in the wild, not clustered around his cabin like some desert-petting zoo. The kindest thing would be to let them drink their fill and send them on their way before they became dependent on human charity. But the smaller foal was lying down now, her sides heaving with the effort of breathing. The desert's rule was simple: adapt or die. These 3 had pushed past the limits of adaptation and were well into the dying phase. Against every instinct that had kept him alive and alone for 10 years, Hank made a decision that felt both inevitable and terrifying. He retrieved the water trough from the shed, noting absently that it still held water, stagnant and green with algae, but water nonetheless. He dumped it out and scrubbed the worst of the accumulated grime away with handfuls of sand. The metal was hot enough to raise blisters, but he managed to wrestle it into the shade beside his cabin. Filling it took multiple trips with every container he owned. His water pressure was never strong enough for a hose, so it was buckets and pots, and the spare radiator fluid jugs he'd been saving for some undefined emergency. With each trip, he told himself this was temporary. Once they'd recovered enough strength to travel, they'd move on. Wild things always moved on. The mother donkey watched his every movement, but didn't interfere. She'd positioned herself between her foals and this strange human, ready to fight if necessary, but willing to accept help if it was genuinely offered. When Hank finally stepped back from the filled trough, she approached cautiously and lowered her head to test the water. Apparently satisfied, she drank deeply, then nudged the larger foal toward the trough. He needed no encouragement, plunging his whole head into the water with obvious relief. But the smaller foal remained where she lay, her breathing still labored. This time, Hank's movement toward her brought no warning from the mother. Desperation had apparently outweighed caution. He knelt beside the little animal, a filly he could see now, and gently lifted her head. Her eyes were glassy with heat exhaustion, but she managed to focus on his face. "Come on, little girl," he murmured, words that felt strange in his mouth after years of silence. Just a little further, supporting her weight, he helped her to the trough. She drank in small, weak sips, but she drank. When she'd had enough, he helped her back to the shade of the cabin, where she immediately lay down again. The mother donkey approached him then, moving with deliberate slowness. When she was close enough to touch, she lowered her head and gently bumped his shoulder, a gesture that seemed to convey both gratitude and a promise that she'd remember this kindness. Standing in the shade beside 3 exhausted donkeys, Hank felt something shift inside his chest. It was subtle, like the first crack in ice at the beginning of spring, but undeniable. For the first time in 10 years, something other than his own survival mattered. He told himself it was temporary. A few days, maybe a week, until they regained their strength. Then they'd disappear back into the desert, and his life would return to its familiar patterns of solitude and routine. But as the afternoon heat pressed down like a physical weight, and the little filly's breathing gradually became less labored, Hank found himself thinking about supplies. If he could find any. Salt blocks. Maybe some feed grain to help them put weight back on. The mother donkey had chosen to trust him with the most precious things in her world. The least he could do was prove worthy of that trust, even if it was only temporary, even if it meant acknowledging that his carefully constructed walls had just developed their first significant crack. The veterinary first aid kit emerged from a forgotten corner of Hank's storage shed, like a ghost from his past life. Dust motes danced in the afternoon light as he pulled the metal box from behind a stack of broken irrigation pipe. He'd bought it years ago for the ranch, back when he'd owned cattle and horses and had reasons to care about animal welfare beyond mere survival. The lock had rusted solid, but a few strategic taps with a hammer convinced it to open. Inside, most of the contents remained intact, bandages gone yellow with age, bottles of antiseptic that had probably lost their potency, a thermometer, and various tools whose purposes came flooding back to him as he examined them. Margaret had teased him about buying such an expensive kit, saying he was more worried about the animals than he was about himself. She'd been right, of course. She usually was. The little filly, he'd started thinking of her as Honey because of her light coat, was the reason he'd retrieved the kit. While her mother and brother had bounced back from their ordeal with the resilience of creatures bred for desert hardship, Honey remained listless. She drank water and ate the sparse grass around his cabin, but something was wrong. A careful examination revealed what he'd suspected. A deep cut on her rear leg, partially hidden by matted hair and dried blood. "Easy, girl," Hank murmured as he approached her. The mother donkey, he decided to call her Grace for her dignified bearing, watched his every movement but didn't interfere. Over the past 3 days, she'd apparently decided he could be trusted with her children's welfare. Honey flinched when he touched the wound, but didn't try to bolt. The cut was clean, probably from barbed wire or sharp rock, but it was infected. Without treatment, it would only get worse in the desert heat. Cleaning and dressing the wound required patience Hank hadn't exercised in years. He worked slowly, talking in low tones to keep the young animal calm. The familiarity of the task surprised him. His hands remembered skills he'd thought long forgotten. Soon he was lost in the rhythm of care, the simple satisfaction of mending something broken. "There you go," he said as he secured the last piece of tape. "That should help." Grace approached as soon as he stepped away, sniffing her daughter thoroughly before giving Hank what he could only interpret as an approving look. The moment struck him as profoundly maternal. A mother checking on her child after a doctor's visit. The memory hit him without warning. Sarah at 7, crying over a scraped knee from a bicycle accident. He'd cleaned the wound just as carefully, applying cartoon bandages she'd insisted were necessary for proper healing. Margaret had stood in the kitchen doorway, smiling at his gentle attention to their daughter's minor injury. "Daddy fixes everything," Sarah had announced, with the absolute faith only children possessed. Hank pushed the memory away and focused on practical matters. The donkeys needed better shelter than the meager shade his cabin provided. The lean-to he'd started building that morning was rough work. Salvaged lumber and corrugated metal held together with determination and prayer. But it would provide protection from sun and rain. As he worked, he found himself studying the family dynamics of his unexpected guests. Grace was clearly the leader, making decisions about where to graze, when to rest, and how close to let him approach. But she was also endlessly patient with her offspring, allowing the young male, who he'd started calling Buck for his stubborn streak, to explore and play while keeping watchful eyes on Honey's slower recovery. The protective instincts reminded him painfully of Margaret. She'd been the same way with Sarah, firm when necessary, but always ready with comfort when their daughter needed it. Hank had been the disciplinarian, the one who established rules and consequences. Margaret had been the safe harbor where Sarah could bring her fears and hurts. After Margaret's death, Sarah had tried to bring those fears and hurts to him. But Hank had been drowning in his own grief, unable to be the father she needed. Instead of comfort, he'd offered awkward silence. Instead of stability, he'd eventually offered absence. "Should have done better," he said aloud, his voice carrying across the empty desert. Grace's ears swiveled toward him, and for a moment he felt as though she understood. The afternoon routine was developing naturally. Water check first. The donkeys drank enormous quantities in the heat. Then food, which meant leading them to the best patches of drought-resistant grass within walking distance of the cabin. Hank found himself talking to them during these expeditions, filling the silence with observations about the weather, the landscape, anything that came to mind. "See that ridge there?" he asked Buck, as they paused in whatever shade they could find. "That's where the old Comstock mine used to be. Played out in the 50s. But folks still go up there looking for what's left." Buck regarded him with dark, intelligent eyes, as though genuinely interested in local history. The talking surprised Hank most of all. He'd gone days at a time without speaking during his decade of isolation, communicating with Pete and the occasional supply run into town through grunts and nods. But the donkeys seemed to invite conversation, perhaps because they listened without judgment or expectation. Evening brought the day's most pleasant hour, when the sun dropped low enough to steal some of its killing power. Hank sat on his porch with a cup of coffee, watching his charges graze nearby. Grace had allowed them to wander further from the cabin as their strength returned, but she always kept them within sight. Honey was moving better already. The antibiotic cream from the first aid kit was clearly helping, and she'd started following her brother on short exploratory missions. Watching them play, gentle headbutts and mock chases in the cooling air stirred something in Hank that he'd thought permanently buried. Joy. Simple, uncomplicated pleasure in watching young things be young. Sarah had played like that, he remembered. Endless games with invisible friends, elaborate stories that turned the ranch into kingdoms, or alien worlds, or whatever her imagination conjured. He'd been too busy with adult concerns to appreciate the gift of her wonder. As the stars emerged in the clear desert sky, Hank found himself making mental lists. Feed supplements to help the donkeys build strength. Better fencing to keep them safe near the cabin. Maybe a proper shelter instead of his makeshift lean-to. The lists worried him. They implied planning beyond the few days he'd originally envisioned. They suggested attachment, investment in outcomes he couldn't control. But as Grace settled her family for the night just outside his circle of light, Hank realized that ship had already sailed. Somewhere between filling the water trough and bandaging Honey's leg, his carefully maintained emotional distance had crumbled. These three creatures trusted him with their safety. For the first time in 10 years, something needed him to be better than merely surviving. The responsibility was terrifying. It was also the closest thing to purpose he'd felt since Margaret's death. The unopened letters revealed themselves when Hank pulled the grain sacks from their storage corner, looking for anything remotely suitable as donkey feed. They'd been wedged behind the bags for years, a bundle of envelopes held together with a rubber band that had long since lost its elasticity. His heart clenched as he recognized Sarah's careful handwriting on the return addresses. 23 letters. He counted them with trembling fingers, noting the dates that spanned nearly a decade. The earliest was postmarked just 6 months after he'd left Barstow. The most recent was from 3 years ago. After that, apparently, she'd given up trying to reach the father who'd chosen desert exile over facing his failures. Hank set the bundle on his kitchen table and stared at it while his coffee grew cold. Each envelope was a conversation they'd never had, a chance for connection he'd deliberately ignored. The weight of unopened words seemed to fill his small cabin, making the air thick and hard to breathe. Through the window, he could see Grace and her foals in their morning routine. Buck was testing his independence, wandering to the edge of their claimed territory before circling back to his mother's watchful presence. Honey had started following him on these expeditions, her healing leg growing stronger each day. The sight of them should have brought pleasure, but all Hank could think about was Sarah at 8, 9, 10, the ages when she'd started pushing boundaries while still needing the security of knowing he was there. Only he hadn't been there, had he? Not really. Not when it mattered. "What's got you spooked this morning?" he asked Grace as she approached the water trough. The big donkey had developed the habit of checking on him during her morning rounds, perhaps sensing the moods that flickered across his weathered face. The talking had become natural over the past week. Grace proved to be an excellent listener, offering thoughtful ear movements and the occasional gentle bump when his voice carried too much pain. Buck was more interested in immediate concerns, food, water, play, but even he would pause in his explorations when Hank's tone grew serious. "Found some old letters," Hank continued, refilling Grace's water. "From my daughter. Haven't read them. Probably should," but he trailed off, lacking words for the fear that paralyzed him whenever he considered opening those envelopes. Grace drank deeply, then lifted her head to study his face with dark, understanding eyes. Without anthropomorphizing too much, Hank could have sworn she was encouraging him to continue. "She was about their age when I left," he said, nodding toward the Foals. "Well, not literally. She was 24, but still figuring things out, you know? Still needed her old man around to make sure she didn't stumble into anything too dangerous." The parallel wasn't lost on him. Grace would never abandon Buck and Honey, no matter how difficult caring for them became. She'd fight coyotes, brave the desert heat, risk her own life before leaving them to face the world alone. What did that make him? What kind of parent walked away when things got hard? The morning routine continued despite his churning thoughts. Fresh water, a check on Honey's healing wound, and a walk to find the best grazing within reasonable distance of the cabin. The donkeys had settled into his life with surprising ease, adapting their wild patterns to accommodate human schedules and the security of reliable water. But supplies were becoming an issue. His small store of canned goods wouldn't last forever, and the donkeys needed more nutrition than desert grass could provide. A trip to town was inevitable, his first in over 3 months. The prospect filled him with familiar dread. "Might have to leave you folks alone for a day," he told Buck, as the young donkey investigated a particularly interesting rock formation. "Need to get proper feed, maybe some salt blocks? Things to keep you healthy." Buck's response was to attempt eating the rock, which struck Hank as a reasonable commentary on the situation. The afternoon brought unexpected drama when Honey got her head stuck in the railings of the makeshift pen Hank had built to contain feed buckets. Her panicked struggles drew Grace and Buck at a run, creating a chaotic scene of braying donkeys and flying hooves. Hank managed to free her without injury to anyone involved, but the incident left him shaky with adrenaline, and something uncomfortably close to parental anxiety scared me there. "Little girl," he admitted, as Honey nuzzled his shoulder in apparent apology. "Reminded me of the time Sarah got her head stuck in the porch railings. She was maybe 4, curious about everything. Margaret had to work soap around her ears while I held her still. Kid cried more about missing her afternoon cartoon than about being stuck." The memory brought others flooding back. Sarah's first day of school, when she'd been too brave to cry, but had gripped his hand so tightly her knuckles went white. Her 10th birthday party, when she'd insisted on inviting the entire class, and had spent the day making sure no one felt left out. The way she'd cried when their old dog Rex had to be put down, and how she'd insisted on a proper burial with flowers and everything. She'd been such a caring child, always bringing home strays, cats, wounded birds, once a baby rabbit she'd found by the roadside. Margaret had joked that Sarah would grow up to be a veterinarian or a saint, possibly both. "Wonder what she did grow up to be," Hank murmured to Grace as they settled into the evening routine. The big donkey was grazing nearby, close enough to hear, but far enough to give him space to wrestle with his thoughts. The letters sat on his table like a challenge. 23 unopened chances to learn about the woman his daughter had become. 23 conversations he'd been too afraid, or too proud, or too broken to have. As the sun set and the desert began its nightly transition to cooler temperatures, Hank found himself drawn back to the cabin. The letters seemed to glow in the lamplight, Sarah's careful handwriting a bridge across years of silence. He picked up the earliest one, turning it over in his hands. The envelope was thin, maybe 2 pages, probably an attempt to keep things light after months of his refusal to communicate. What had she written? Probably updates about her life, maybe gentle attempts to understand why he'd left, or maybe accusations, maybe rightful anger at a father who'd chosen running away over staying to help his daughter process her own grief. "Only one way to find out," he said to the empty room, but his hands remained frozen, holding the letter like it might explode and take what remained of his carefully constructed peace with it. The child's music box played 3 notes of Fur-Elise before the mechanism seized with a grinding protest. Hank had found it at the bottom of a storage box he'd been searching through for rope to reinforce the donkey shelter. The tiny pink ballerina, frozen mid-spin in her faded tutu, brought back a rush of memory so vivid it left him breathless. Sarah's 6th birthday. Margaret had saved for months to buy the music box, hiding it in their bedroom closet and swearing Hank to secrecy. Sarah had opened it with the careful reverence children reserved for truly special gifts, her eyes wide as the ballerina spun to the tinkling melody. She'd insisted on winding it every night before bed, falling asleep to the gentle tune. "Found it at an estate sale," Margaret had whispered to him that night as they watched Sarah dance along with the tiny ballerina. The woman said it belonged to her grandmother, thought it needed a little girl to love it again. Now the music box sat silent in Hank's weathered hands, its mechanism broken by years of neglect. Like everything else he'd touched, it seemed. He'd packed it when he sold the ranch, unable to throw away something that had brought Sarah such joy, but equally unable to face the memories it carried. Through the cabin's single window, he could see Buck and Honey engaged in one of their elaborate games. They'd invented a version of tag that involved circling the water trough at increasingly reckless speeds, taking turns being chaser and chased. The joy was infectious. Even Grace seemed to smile as she watched from her shady spot beside the cabin. The contrast between their carefree play and his own heavy reflections struck Hank as particularly cruel. When had he lost the ability to find simple pleasure in simple things? When had everything become so weighted with regret and might-have-beens? He knew the answer, of course. It had started with Margaret's diagnosis. Breast cancer, stage 3, discovered during what should have been a routine checkup. The treatment had been brutal, chemotherapy that left her weak and nauseous, radiation that burned her skin, surgeries that carved away pieces of the woman he'd loved since high school. Through it all, Margaret had faced each day with courage that humbled him. She'd made jokes during chemo sessions, flirted with him even when the treatments left her bald and exhausted, spent her good days focused on Sarah's senior year of high school rather than her own mortality, but Hank had been drowning. Watching the strongest person he knew waste away had shattered something fundamental in his worldview. If Margaret, who'd never smoked, rarely drank, exercised religiously and ate her vegetables, could be struck down by something so random and vicious, then what was the point of anything? What was the point of hope, of planning, of believing in happy endings? He'd tried to hide his despair from Sarah, but 18-year-olds were perceptive creatures. She'd seen through his forced optimism to the panic underneath. Instead of being able to comfort her during the worst period of her young life, he'd become another source of worry. "Dad, are you okay?" She'd asked one evening as they sat in the hospital waiting room during one of Margaret's longer procedures. "I'm fine." "Sweetheart," he'd lied, staring at his hands to avoid seeing the concern in her eyes. "Just tired," but he hadn't been fine. He'd been falling apart in slow motion, and Sarah had been forced to be strong for both of them. The music box caught the afternoon light streaming through the window. Its pink surface faded, but still retaining hints of the vibrant color it had once been. Hank turned the key gently, hoping the mechanism might cooperate. It managed half a rotation before seizing again. The ballerina left, suspended in an awkward position. "I broke you too," he whispered to the tiny dancer. Grace appeared at the window, her presence as reliable as sunrise. She'd taken to checking on him throughout the day, particularly when his mood grew dark. How she could sense his emotional state through a glass window remained a mystery, but her timing was uncanny. "Just finding old things," he told her through the glass. "Things I should have taken better care of." Grace's ears swiveled forward, and she moved closer to the window until her breath fogged the glass. The gesture felt like an invitation to continue. She loved this music box, Hank said, holding it up so Grace could see. Played it every night until the batteries in her CD player died, and even then she'd wind it up just to hear those few notes. Margaret used to say Sarah would dance to silence, if that's all she had. The memory of Sarah dancing struck him with unexpected force. She'd been naturally graceful, inheriting Margaret's elegance along with her stubborn streak. They'd enrolled her in ballet classes when she was 7, and she'd thrown herself into it with typical determination. Every recital, every practice session, every small triumph had been documented and celebrated. When had he stopped celebrating her triumphs? When had he become so focused on his own failures that he'd missed her successes? The answer was uncomfortable but clear. It had started during Margaret's illness and accelerated after her death. Instead of drawing closer to the one person who understood his loss, he'd retreated into himself. Sarah had needed a father who could help her process grief, plan for college, navigate the transition to adulthood. Instead, she'd gotten a broken man who could barely function. "I was supposed to protect her," he said to Grace, his voice barely above a whisper. "Supposed to be the one she could count on. Instead, I became one more thing she had to worry about." Buck and Honey had tired of their game and were now investigating something near the storage shed. Probably the lizard that lived under the woodpile. Their easy companionship reminded Hank of the relationship he and Sarah had once shared. Before responsibility and tragedy had turned him into a stranger in his own family, Grace's protective instincts were absolute. She'd position herself between any perceived threat and her foals without hesitation. She'd go without water to make sure they had enough. She'd face down predators, weather, human interference, anything that might harm them, but she'd never simply abandon them. No matter how difficult things became, no matter how much easier it might be to walk away, Grace would stay. Because that's what mothers did. That's what parents did. That's what Hank should have done. He set the music box carefully on the windowsill where Sarah's ballerina could catch the light. The mechanism might be broken, but the memory it held was intact. Sarah spinning in their living room, arms outstretched, face bright with joy and possibility. She'd deserved better than a father who'd let his own pain eclipse her needs. She'd deserved better than abandonment disguised as nobility. She still deserved better. The realization settled over him like desert heat, inescapable and transformative. 10 years of self-imposed exile hadn't healed anything. It had only calcified his wounds, turning temporary grief into permanent isolation. Maybe it was time to stop running from the life he'd thrown away and start figuring out how to build something new from what remained. The worn leather. Halter had belonged to Thunder, Hank's old quarter horse, dead now for 15 years. Finding it in the tack-room corner brought back memories of patient training sessions in the round pen, teaching a spirited colt to accept guidance without losing his essential wildness. Now, as Hank worked the supple leather in his hands, he wondered if the same principles might apply to a stubborn donkey named Grace. The process required more patience than he'd exercised in years. Unlike Thunder, who'd been bred for partnership with humans, Grace carried the wariness of truly wild stock. Every interaction was a negotiation, every gesture subject to her careful evaluation. Hank found himself moving more slowly, speaking more softly, respecting boundaries he'd forgotten existed. "Easy there, girl," he murmured as Grace approached the halter with obvious suspicion. "Just trying to make things easier for both of us." The breakthrough came on the third day of consistent effort. Grace allowed him to slip the halter over her head, standing still while he adjusted the fit and secured the buckles. Her acceptance felt like a profound gift, trust offered by a creature who had every reason to fear human intentions. Leading her to fresh grazing areas became a daily ritual. Grace walked beside him with dignified cooperation, occasionally testing the boundaries, but never truly fighting his guidance. Buck and Honey followed, their natural herd instincts keeping them close to their mother's steady presence. "You know," Hank found himself saying during one of these walks, "I used to train horses for a living. Before I got into the cattle business. Started when I was maybe 14, working for old Tom Brennan down in Victorville." Grace's ears flicked back toward his voice. And Hank took this as encouragement to continue. "Tom taught me that patience was everything. Said you could break a horse fast, but if you wanted a real partner, you had to earn their respect. Take as long as it takes." Hank paused, remembering his younger self's impatience with such philosophies. Wish I'd remembered that lesson when it mattered most. The irony wasn't lost on him. He could spend hours working with a donkey, reading her moods, adjusting his approach to accommodate her fears and instincts. But with Sarah, his own daughter, flesh of his flesh, he'd been clumsy, impatient, ultimately absent when she'd needed him most. The veterinarian's visit disrupted their routine. 3 weeks into their cohabitation, Dr. Elena Vasquez arrived in a battered pickup truck that had seen as many desert miles as Hank's own vehicle, her manner both professional and refreshingly direct. "Heard you got some wild donkeys," she said, examining Grace with the quick competence of someone who'd dealt with stubborn livestock all her life. "Not many people around here would take them in." "They needed help," Hank replied, watching anxiously as she checked Honey's healing wound. "This one's doing well. Clean healing, no infection. You did good work." Dr. Vasquez moved to examine Buck, who submitted to her attention with typical adolescent dignity. "How long you planning to keep them?" The question caught Hank off guard. He'd been thinking in terms of days, maybe weeks, temporary sanctuary until they regained their strength. But watching Dr. Vasquez's efficient examination, he realized how much he'd invested in their welfare. "Haven't really thought that far ahead," he admitted. "Might want to start. Wild donkeys can live 30 years or more." These three are young, healthy. They could be with you for a long time. She straightened, fixing him with a knowing look. They've bonded with you. Grace there follows you around like a lovesick teenager. Breaking that bond wouldn't be easy on any of you. After the vet left, Hank sat on his porch and contemplated 30 years of donkey companionship. The prospect should have terrified him. 30 years of responsibility, of caring about creatures whose welfare depended on his decisions. Instead, he felt something suspiciously like relief. "So what do you think?" he asked Grace as she grazed nearby. 30 years sound manageable to you?" Grace lifted her head and regarded him with what might have been amusement before returning to her serious business of eating everything green within reach. That evening brought an unexpected visitor. Pete's truck appeared on the horizon just as the sun was beginning its descent toward the mountains. The old prospector emerged from his vehicle with the careful movements of a man whose joints had logged too many years of hard desert living. "Heard you got yourself some livestock," Pete said without preamble. He'd never been one for social niceties. "News travels fast," Hank replied, pouring coffee for both of them. "Elena mentioned it. Also mentioned you might want to think about making it legal. Wild donkeys got protections under federal law. You can't just keep them without paperwork." The bureaucratic complexities hadn't occurred to Hank. In his mind, he'd simply provided shelter to creatures in need. The idea that forms and permits might be involved seemed absurd. "There's a woman in Barstow who handles that kind of thing," Pete continued. "Sarah Williams, I think her name is. Works with the Bureau of Land Management on wild horse and burro adoptions." The name hit Hank like a physical blow. "Sarah?" "Yeah, young woman, maybe 30-something. Real good with the legal side of animal rescue." Pete squinted at Hank's suddenly pale face. "You know her?" "She's my daughter." The silence stretched between them like a desert highway. Pete's weathered features showed no surprise. Very little surprised him after 60 years in the Mojave, but his understanding was complete. "Well," he said finally, "that's something." After Pete left, Hank walked his property lines in the gathering darkness. Grace and her foals followed at a respectful distance, their presence both comforting and accusatory. He'd been working to earn a wild donkey's trust, while his own daughter had been building a career, helping people exactly like him. The pattern was clear once he stopped avoiding it. Whenever relationships became complicated, whenever emotional stakes grew too high, he ran. He'd done it after Margaret's death, abandoning Sarah when she'd needed him most. He was doing it still, hiding in the desert, while she built a life that would have made them both proud. Grace nudged his shoulder gently, calling his attention back to the present moment. Her dark eyes reflected starlight, holding depths of understanding that seemed almost human. "Think she'd want to see me?" he asked the donkey. "After all this time, after everything I've done wrong?" Grace's answer was to rest her head against his chest, her warm breath stirring the desert air between them. The gesture spoke of forgiveness, of second chances, of the possibility that some bonds, once formed, could survive even the worst mistakes. Maybe. It was time to find out if that was true for fathers and daughters too. The legal documents spilled from the manila envelope like accusations scattered across Hank's kitchen table. He'd been searching for the cabin's original deed, something about property taxes and the wild donkey adoption paperwork, when he'd found the folder he'd hoped never to open again. Foreclosure notices, medical bills stamped "final notice" in red ink, credit card statements showing balances that had climbed past any reasonable hope of repayment. Insurance denial letters that had arrived with clockwork regularity throughout Margaret's final year. $347,000. That's what saving his wife's life had cost, after insurance covered what they deemed necessary and denied what they classified as experimental. Hank spread the papers across the table with hands that trembled slightly, remembering the desperate arithmetic that had consumed his final months at the ranch. The oncologist in Los Angeles had been brutally honest. "There's a treatment trial in Houston," he'd said, reviewing Margaret's latest scans. "It's not covered by insurance, and there's no guarantee it will work. But given the aggressive nature of her cancer, it might be her best option." Might be. Two words that had cost them everything. Grace appeared at the window, drawn by some instinct that told her Hank was in distress. Her presence should have been comforting, but all he could think about was the parallel, another creature depending on him for survival. Another chance to fail someone who trusted him. The Houston treatment had bought Margaret 6 additional months. 6 months of hope and experimental drugs and medical bills that arrived faster than he could process them. He'd remortgaged the ranch, liquidated their retirement accounts, maxed out every credit card he could qualify for. When that wasn't enough, he'd started selling cattle, then equipment, then pieces of the ranch itself. Sarah had tried to help. She'd offered her college fund, her small savings account, even suggested taking out student loans to contribute to her mother's care. But Hank had refused every offer, convinced that protecting her financial future was more important than accepting her help. "This isn't your burden, sweetheart," he told her when she'd pressed the issue. "Your job is to be 24 and build your own life. Let me worry about the rest." The pride in that decision felt poisonous now. He'd robbed Sarah of the chance to fight for her mother, reduced her to a helpless observer while he made desperate financial decisions that doomed them all. The ranch went into foreclosure proceedings 2 weeks after Margaret's funeral. Hank had known it was coming. The letters had been arriving for months, but the finality still shocked him. 40 acres of prime grazing land, the home where he'd planned to grow old with Margaret, the legacy he'd hoped to leave Sarah, all gone to pay for 6 months that hadn't saved anyone. Sarah had wanted to help then too. She'd researched bankruptcy lawyers, talked about refinancing options, suggested they fight the foreclosure together. But Hank had already made his decision. Better to sell what he could salvage and disappear than to drag his daughter down into the financial quicksand that had swallowed everything else. "I'll be fine," he'd told her as he packed his truck with the few possessions that hadn't been sold or repossessed. "I need some time alone to figure things out. This isn't goodbye forever, but it had been, hadn't it?" He'd taken his guilt and his financial ruin and his crushing sense of failure, and he'd buried them all in the desert where Sarah couldn't see them. He'd convinced himself it was noble, sparing her the burden of his problems. In reality, it was cowardice dressed up as sacrifice. The mother donkey outside his window offered a sharp contrast to his own parental failures. When her foals had needed help, Grace had swallowed her pride and brought them to the only source of assistance available. She'd risked everything, including her own safety, to give them a chance at survival. Hank had done the opposite. When his family had faced crisis, he'd let pride and shame drive his decisions. Instead of asking for help, he'd isolated himself. Instead of letting Sarah share the burden, he'd carried it alone until it crushed him. The cruelest document in the pile was a promissory note he'd forgotten about: money, borrowed from Margaret's sister Carol to pay for one of the experimental treatments. Carol had forgiven the debt after Margaret's death, but the paperwork remained. A reminder of how far he'd fallen from the self-sufficient man he'd once been. "I became a charity case," he said aloud, his voice bitter in the quiet cabin. "Couldn't stand the thought of Sarah seeing me as anything less than the father who could fix everything." Through the window, he watched Buck and Honey playing their endless games, while Grace supervised from nearby shade. The family unit was intact, functioning, supportive. Grace had brought her children to safety and maintained their bond throughout the crisis. She'd shown vulnerability without losing authority, accepted help without sacrificing dignity, everything Hank had failed to do. The knock at his door came as surprise. Pete stood on the porch, but he wasn't alone. A young woman in khaki BLM uniform stood beside him, clipboard in hand and official bearing, that made Hank's stomach clench. "This is Sarah Williams," Pete said without preamble. "Told you about her yesterday. She's here about the donkey adoption paperwork." Sarah Williams. His Sarah. Hank's vision tunneled as he took in details that were both familiar and foreign. She had Margaret's bone structure, his stubborn chin, and eyes that were older than her 34 years deserved. Her dark hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail, and her handshake was firm when she extended it. "Mr. Dillard, I understand you've been caring for 3 wild burros. Her voice was Margaret's voice, warm but professional. She showed no recognition of his name, no indication that she'd connected this weathered desert hermit with the father who'd abandoned her a decade ago. That's right, Hank managed, his throat dry as sand. Mind if I take a look at them? I need to assess their condition and discuss the adoption process. They walked to where Grace and her foals were grazing. Sarah, making notes on her clipboard and asking questions about their health, their behavior, their integration into his daily routine. Her expertise was obvious, her genuine care for the animals evident in every question. They're in excellent condition, she said finally. Better than most wild animals we recover. You've done good work with them. They needed help, Hank replied, the same words he'd given Dr. Vasquez, but loaded now with different meaning. Yes, they did. And you provided it. Sarah looked up from her clipboard, studying his face with professional assessment that gradually shifted to something more personal. Do I know you? You seem familiar. The moment of truth arrived like a desert storm, sudden, inevitable, transformative. Hank could continue the charade. Let her finish her paperwork and leave, without knowing she'd just evaluated her own father's attempt at redemption. Or he could find the courage to do what Grace had done. Swallow his pride and ask for help. My name is Hank Dillard, he said, his voice steady despite the earthquake in his chest. And you're my daughter. The clipboard slipped from Sarah's hands, papers scattering in the desert wind. Pete muttered something about needing to check his truck and retreated with tactical wisdom. Grace, as if sensing the gravity of the moment, approached slowly and stood between father and daughter like a blessing made flesh. Dad, Sarah's voice broke on the word. 10 years of pain and confusion and love compressed into a single syllable. I'm sorry, sweetheart, Hank said, and meant it more than any words he'd ever spoken. I'm so sorry for everything. The old cell phone had been dead for 3 years, its battery swollen from desert heat and neglect. But as Hank sat across from Sarah at his kitchen table, watching her struggle with emotions that flickered across her face like shadows, he knew he needed every tool available to bridge. The chasm his choices had created, Sarah had insisted on, completing her official paperwork first, a professional reflex that brought them both. Time to process the impossibility of their situation. The donkey adoption forms were signed and filed. Grace and her foals, officially his responsibility now. Pete had departed with mumbled promises to check on them later, leaving father and daughter alone with 10 years of silence between them. You look older, Sarah said finally, her voice carefully neutral. She'd taken the chair across from him, maintaining distance while studying his weathered face like she was memorizing a stranger. Feel older too, Hank admitted. Desert living ages a man pretty fast. Is that what you call it? Desert living? The anger that had been simmering beneath her professional composure finally surfaced. Because I called it abandonment. I called it cowardice. The words hit like physical blows, but Hank forced himself to accept them. You're right. Both of those things. Do you have any idea what it was like? Sarah's voice cracked slightly. Mom dies, and 2 months later my father just disappears. No explanation, no forwarding address. Just gone. Hank pulled the cell phone from a kitchen drawer, its screen cracked but functional once he'd found the charger. I kept meaning to call. Every day for the first year, I'd think about it. But what could I say? How do you explain to your daughter that you failed at everything that mattered? You could have started with I'm sorry, Sarah shot back. You could have started with I need help. The simple truth of it made Hank's chest tight. I was supposed to be the one helping you. Not the other way around. Says who? Sarah leaned forward, her professional composure completely gone now. Who made that rule? When did you decide that being my father meant carrying everything alone? Through the window, Grace and her foals grazed peacefully in the afternoon heat, their family unit intact despite the crisis that had brought them together. Hank found himself envying their simplicity, protection offered and accepted without the complex pride that had destroyed his own family. The bills, he said finally. Mom's medical bills. They destroyed everything. The ranch, our savings, my credit. I lost it all trying to save her, and when that didn't work, I couldn't face losing you too." Sarah's expression shifted from anger to confusion. "What are you talking about? You never told me about any bills." Hank retrieved the manila envelope from the table, spreading the foreclosure notices and medical bills between them like evidence in a trial. Sarah's eyes widened as she processed the scope of the financial devastation. $347,000, Hank said quietly. "That's what the experimental treatments cost. After insurance, after liquidating everything we owned. I mortgaged the ranch twice, maxed out every credit card, borrowed against my life insurance. None of it was enough. My God, Dad, why didn't you tell me?" Sarah picked up one of the medical bills, her hands trembling slightly. "I could have helped. We could have figured something out together. You were 24, just starting your career. I wasn't going to destroy your future too. That wasn't your decision to make." The words erupted from Sarah with surprising force. "She was my mother too. I had a right to help save her, and I had a right to know when you were drowning." The cell phone finally came to life with a cheerful chime that seemed absurd in the context of their conversation. Hank stared at the screen, noting 17 missed calls from various debt collectors, numbers he'd never bothered to update when he'd moved to the desert. "I convinced myself I was protecting you," he said, setting the phone aside, "letting you build a life without getting dragged down by my failures. Noble, right? Except all I really did was rob you of the chance to say goodbye properly. You robbed me of more than that." Sarah's voice was softer now, but the pain was still sharp. "You robbed me of my father when I needed him most. You robbed me of the chance to grieve with someone who loved her as much as I did." The accusation hung in the desert air like heat shimmer. Outside, Buck was attempting to convince Honey to join him in investigating something near the property line, while Grace maintained her watchful supervision. Their easy companionship mocked the broken relationship sitting at Hank's kitchen table. "I remarried," Sarah said suddenly. 5 years ago. Tom Williams. He's a good man. A teacher. We have 2 kids now." The words hit Hank like a physical blow. Remarried, grandchildren, a whole life built in his absence. Milestones he'd missed through his own stubborn pride. "That's wonderful," he managed, though the words felt like sand in his mouth. "I'm happy for you, are you?" Sarah's laugh was bitter. "Because you missed the wedding. You missed Emily's birth and Jake's first steps and every Christmas and birthday and school play. You missed everything that mattered." Hank closed his eyes, trying to imagine the children he'd never met, the son-in-law who'd stepped into the role he'd abandoned. "What are they like?" "Emily and Jake. Emily's 8. She's brilliant, reads everything she can get her hands on, and asks questions that would stump a philosophy professor. Jake's 5, and he's all energy and mischief. He builds elaborate structures out of anything he can find, and then destroys them just to see what happens." Sarah's voice softened as she talked about her children. "They don't know about you. How do I explain a grandfather who chose to disappear?" The question cut deeper than any accusation. "Maybe you don't. Maybe some mistakes are too big to fix." "Don't you dare." Sarah's anger flared again. "Don't you dare make this decision for me too. You don't get to decide what's best for my children any more than you got to decide what was best for me." The cell phone buzzed with a text message, probably a scammer, but the sound made them both jump. Technology felt intrusive in this space of raw emotion and desert silence. "I've been working with wild horses and burros for 8 years, Sarah said, seemingly changing subjects. "You want to know why?" Hank nodded, not trusting his voice. "Because they remind me of you. Proud, stubborn, convinced that isolation is safety. Most of them have been hurt by humans, by life, by circumstances beyond their control. They think the answer is to never trust anyone again." Sarah gestured toward the window where Grace stood watching them. "But that one out there, she brought her babies to you when they needed help. She swallowed her pride and took a chance on human kindness." "Grace is braver than I am," Hank admitted. "Maybe, or maybe she's just a better parent." The words stung, but Sarah's tone had lost its angry edge. "The question is, what are you going to do now?" Hank looked at the cell phone, then at the legal documents scattered across his table. Finally, at his daughter's face, older than he remembered, marked by the life he'd missed, but still recognizably the little girl who'd once danced to music box melodies. "I want to try," he said finally. "I want to try to be better than I was, to be the father and grandfather you deserve. But I don't know how to start." "You start by not disappearing again," Sarah said simply. "You start by staying, even when things get difficult, even when you think you're failing." Outside, the sun was beginning its descent toward the mountains, painting the desert in shades of gold and amber. Grace had moved closer to the cabin, drawn by some instinct that told her the conversation inside was reaching a crucial point. "There's something else," Sarah said, her voice hesitant now. "Something I need to tell you." Hank's chest tightened, preparing for another revelation that might shatter what remained of his carefully constructed world. "Tom and we've been talking about having another baby. We're not young anymore, and it would be a risk, but—" She paused, struggling with words. "I've always wanted my children to know their grandfather. The real one, not the ghost I've been carrying around. The possibility of redemption hung between them like a bridge across an impossible chasm. New life, second chances, the opportunity to be present for moments that mattered. I'd like that," Hank said, his voice rough with emotion. "I'd like that very much." The cell phone buzzed again, and this time Hank picked it up. A new message from an unknown number, probably spam. But he found himself thinking about connection, about reaching across distances, both physical and emotional. 10 years of silence was about to end. The question now was whether either of them was brave enough to build something new from the ruins of what they'd lost. The handwritten letter took Hank 3 attempts before he found words that came close to expressing 10 years of regret. Sarah had left with promises to return in a few days, needing time to process their reunion and figure out how to explain his existence to her family. The space between them felt different now, still fragile but no longer impossibly wide. "Dear Sarah," he wrote by lamplight as Grace and her foals settled for the night outside his window. "I know we talked today, but there are things I should have said better, things I couldn't find the courage to put into words while looking at the hurt in your eyes. Maybe it's easier to be honest with a piece of paper. Lord knows I've always been better with my hands than my mouth when it comes to important things." Hank paused, listening to the desert night sounds that had become his only companions for so long. A coyote called in the distance, answered by another from the hills. The sound had once seemed lonely to him. Tonight it sounded like conversation. "I need you to understand that leaving wasn't about not loving you. It was about loving you too much to let you watch me fall apart completely. I know how that sounds, selfish dressed up as noble, but at the time it felt like the only choice that made sense. Your mother's death broke something in me that I didn't know how to fix. Not just the grief, though that was crushing enough. It was the failure. I was supposed to protect her, to provide for her, to find a way to make everything okay. Instead, I watched the strongest person I knew waste away while I threw money at problems that money couldn't solve. The pen felt clumsy in his weathered hands, more accustomed to tools and rope than careful penmanship. But the words came easier than he'd expected, as if they'd been waiting years for release when the bills started coming, really coming. Not just the regular insurance co-pays, but the experimental treatments, the specialists, the procedures that might buy us a few more months. I made decisions I'm not proud of. I told myself I was being practical, that someone had to handle the adult responsibilities while you focused on saying goodbye to your mother. But the truth is, I was terrified. Terrified of losing her. Terrified of being poor. Terrified of becoming the kind of man who couldn't take care of his family. So I took care of everything myself. Made all the financial decisions myself. Carried all the burden myself. And when it still wasn't enough, when she died anyway, and the creditors came calling, I couldn't face admitting that I'd failed at the one thing that mattered most. Through the window, he could see Grace's silhouette in the moonlight. She'd positioned herself between the cabin and her sleeping foals, alert even in rest. A mother's protective instincts never truly stopped, even when the immediate danger had passed. You said today that I robbed you of the chance to help save her, and you're absolutely right. I robbed you of the chance to be a full partner in fighting for her life. I reduced you to a spectator in your own family's crisis, because I couldn't admit that I needed help. But the worst part, the part that's eaten at me every day for 10 years, is that I robbed you of the chance to help save me too. After Mom died, when the ranch went into foreclosure, and I was drowning in debt and guilt, you offered to help. You wanted to fight the foreclosure together, find solutions together, grieve together. Instead, I packed up my failures and disappeared into the desert like some kind of tragic hero, except there was nothing heroic about it. It was cowardice, pure and simple. I was afraid you'd see me as I really was, a broken man who'd gambled everything on saving his wife and lost. I thought if I disappeared, you could remember me as the father who used to fix everything, instead of learning that some things can't be fixed. Hank set down the pen and rubbed his eyes, exhausted by the emotional excavation. Writing the truth was harder than he'd expected, like surgery performed on himself without anesthesia. Watching Grace with her foals has taught me things I should have learned years ago. When they were in crisis, she didn't abandon them, to spare them the burden of her own vulnerability. She brought them to safety and stayed with them through the recovery. She showed strength by accepting help, not by refusing it. I should have done the same. I should have let you help me fight for Mom's life and deal with the aftermath of losing her. I should have let you see me fail and struggle and figure out how to rebuild. Instead, I decided that protecting you from my problems was more important than letting you be part of the solution. The letter was growing longer than he'd intended, but the words kept coming. Years of things he should have said, explanations he should have offered, apologies he should have made. You told me about Emily and Jake today, and about the baby you and Tom are considering. I can't undo the grandfather I failed to be for your first 2 children, but if you'll let me, I'd like to try to be better for the next one. I'd like to be present for the birth, to hold my grandchild while they're still small enough to fit in these old hands. I know I don't have the right to ask for anything after 10 years of silence. I know trust has to be earned, not given. But I'm asking anyway, because that's what Grace taught me, sometimes. Swallowing your pride and asking for help is the bravest thing you can do. I want to meet Emily and Jake. I want to know what makes them laugh and what scares them and what they dream about when they're sleeping. I want to be the kind of grandfather who shows up for school plays and birthday parties and all the small moments that matter. I want to learn how to be family again. Hank's hand was cramping from the unaccustomed writing, but he pressed on. This might be his only chance to say these things properly, to lay out everything he'd kept buried in the desert silence. The donkeys will be part of any life I build now. Grace and Buck and Honey, their family too in their way. They reminded me that caring for something other than yourself is what makes life worth living. They reminded me that accepting help isn't weakness, it's wisdom. If you'll have me, I'd like to introduce them to Emily and Jake. I think kids and donkeys understand each other in ways adults forget. Maybe Grace can teach your children what she taught me, that love sometimes means being brave enough to trust someone with your vulnerabilities. I love you, Sarah. I've loved you every day of these 10 years, even when I was too broken and proud to show it. You deserved better than a father who disappeared when things got hard. You deserved better than silence when you needed conversation. You deserved better than a man who chose martyrdom over vulnerability. I can't change the past, but I can change what happens next. If you'll give me the chance, I'd like to spend whatever years I have left trying to be the father and grandfather you deserve. Not perfect, I'm past pretending I could be that, but present, available, willing to stay even when things get difficult. The desert taught me how to survive alone. But Grace and her foals taught me something more important. Survival isn't enough. Connection is what makes life worth living, even when it comes with the risk of loss and disappointment. I'm ready to take that risk again. I'm ready to be your father again if you'll let me. All my love, Dad Hank folded the letter carefully and placed it in an envelope, his movements deliberate in the lamplight. Tomorrow, when Sarah returned, he would give it to her. Tonight, he would sit with the weight of everything he'd written, everything he'd finally admitted to himself. Outside, Grace stirred and lifted her head, checking on her sleeping Foals before settling back into her protective vigil. The sight brought him peace. Some bonds, once formed, could survive even the worst mistakes. Maybe. It was time to find out if that was true for fathers and daughters, too. The plane ticket felt impossibly light in Hank's weathered hands, a small piece of paper that represented the end of 10 years of self-imposed exile. Southwest Airlines, Flight 1247, departing Las Vegas for San Diego. One way, because he didn't know how long this journey might take, or what condition his heart might be in when it ended. Sarah had called the morning after he'd given her the letter, her voice thick with tears he couldn't see through the phone line. "I read it 3 times, she'd said without preamble. "And Tom read it too. He wants to meet you." "I'd like that," Hank had replied, the words steady despite the earthquake in his chest. "The kids know about you now. Emily has about 1,000 questions, and Jake wants to know if you have any animals he can meet." "I told them about Grace and Buck and Honey." "What did you tell them about me?" "The truth. That their grandfather made some mistakes but wants very much to be part of their lives, and they're okay with that." Sarah's laugh had been watery but genuine. "Dad, they're 8 and 5. They're okay with anything that involves meeting donkeys." Now 3 days later, Hank stood in his cabin making final preparations for the longest journey he'd taken in a decade. Dr. Vasquez had agreed to check on the donkeys twice daily while he was gone. Pete would handle any emergencies and maintain the water supply. The arrangements were solid, but leaving still felt like stepping off a cliff. Grace watched his preparations with the patient attention she'd learned to give his various projects. Over the past month, she'd become remarkably attuned to his moods, approaching when he needed comfort and giving space when he needed to work through problems alone. Now, as he packed his single duffel bag with clothing that felt foreign after years of work clothes, she seemed to sense that something significant was happening. "I'm going to see Sarah," he told her as she followed him to the truck. "My daughter." "The one I told you about?" Grace's ears swiveled forward. A gesture he'd learned meant she was listening with her full attention. "I'll be back," he promised, scratching behind her ears the way she liked. "This isn't me running away again. This is me trying to run towards something instead." Buck and Honey had adapted to his departure preparations with typical youthful resilience. They'd investigated his luggage thoroughly, attempted to eat his plane ticket, and were now engaged in their usual afternoon game of tag around the water trough. Their easy acceptance of change reminded him that healing didn't have to be complicated. Sometimes it was as simple as trusting that tomorrow would bring what it brought. The drive to Las Vegas took 3 hours through landscape that had become as familiar as his own reflection. Desert valleys that had seemed impossibly empty when he'd first arrived now felt like home. Each mile marker counted down his remaining time in the safety of isolation. But instead of panic, Hank felt something approaching peace at the airport. Surrounded by the chaos of travelers and announcements and humanity in all its messy complexity, he almost turned back. The desert had been quiet, predictable, safe. This world of connecting flights and rental cars and hotel reservations felt overwhelming after so much solitude. But then his phone buzzed with a text from Sarah. "Emily made you a welcome sign. It has glitter." Lots of glitter. Fair warning, the image of an 8-year-old granddaughter. He'd never met crafting a glittery welcome sign for a grandfather she'd only just learned existed was enough to carry him through security and onto the plane. His hands shook slightly as he buckled his seatbelt, but he didn't run. The flight attendant, a young woman about Sarah's age, noticed his white-knuckled grip on the armrests. "First time flying?" she asked kindly. "First time in a long time," Hank admitted. "Going to meet my grandchildren. How wonderful. They must be excited." "I hope so. I've been away for a while. Well, I'm sure they'll be thrilled to see you." As the plane lifted off, Las Vegas falling away beneath them, Hank thought about Grace and her foals back in the desert. Grace had taken the ultimate risk when she'd brought her babies to his cabin, trusting a stranger with the most precious things in her world. Now he was doing the same, trusting Sarah and her family with what remained of his heart. The parallelism wasn't lost on him. Grace had shown vulnerability to save her children. He was showing vulnerability to save himself, to reclaim the family connections he'd thrown away in his grief and pride. Somewhere over the Mojave, flying above the desert that had sheltered him for a decade, Hank finally understood what Grace had tried to teach him from the beginning. Courage wasn't the absence of fear. It was moving forward despite the fear, taking action even when the outcome was uncertain. The plane banked toward San Diego, carrying him toward a granddaughter who made glittery signs and a grandson who wanted to meet donkeys. Toward a daughter who'd forgiven him despite having every reason not to. Toward a son-in-law who'd agreed to welcome a stranger into his family. Toward the possibility of becoming the man Grace had always believed he could be, someone worthy of trust. Someone brave enough to stay when staying was hard. The desert fell away beneath him, but he carried its lessons forward. Survival wasn't enough. Connection was everything, and sometimes the bravest thing you could do was simply show up. The new family photo captured a moment Hank had never dared to imagine, himself surrounded by people who loved him despite his failures. Sarah had insisted on taking it during their visit to the desert, 6 months after their reunion. In the image, Emily and Jake flanked their grandfather, beaming gap-toothed grins, while Grace and her foals grazed peacefully in the background. Tom stood with his arm around Sarah, who held their newest addition, baby Margaret, named for the grandmother she'd never meet, but whose legacy lived on in this moment of connection. Grandpa Hank, Jake had announced on that first meeting at the San Diego airport. Mom says you have donkeys, and they saved your life. The simplicity of a 5-year-old's understanding had cut straight to the truth. Grace and her foals had saved his life, not by dramatic rescue, but through the quiet persistence of daily care, the slow rebuild of his capacity for love. Emily, more thoughtful at 8, had studied his weathered face with serious eyes. Mom says you were sad for a long time. Are you still sad? Sometimes, Hank had answered honestly, but much less than before. Having family makes the sadness smaller. The weeks that followed had been a revelation. Staying in Sarah's guest room, learning his grandchildren's routines, discovering how naturally affection could flow between generations when pride wasn't blocking the current. Jake's boundless energy reminded him of Sarah at that age. Always building something, always asking why, always ready for the next adventure. Emily's quiet intelligence echoed Margaret's careful observation of the world, her gentle questions that revealed depths beyond her years. Tom had proven to be everything Hank could have hoped for in a son-in-law. Kind, patient, genuinely interested in understanding the man who'd shaped his wife's early years. They'd spent long evenings on the back patio, talking about teaching and ranching and the strange ways life could circle back on itself. Sarah's been hurt by your absence, Tom had said during one of these conversations, his words careful but honest. But she's also been strengthened by learning to forgive. Watching her choose grace over resentment has been one of the privileges of loving her. The visit to the desert had been Emily's idea. I want to meet the donkeys who helped Grandpa get better, she'd announced, with the certainty that only children possessed. So they'd packed into 2 vehicles, Sarah's sensible SUV and Tom's pickup truck, and made the pilgrimage to the place where Hank's healing had begun. Grace had approached the children with her characteristic caution, but something about their open curiosity had won her trust quickly. Within hours, Emily was reading aloud from her chapter book, while sitting in the shade of the donkey shelter, Buck and Honey drowsing nearby like oversized cats. Jake had appointed himself Grace's official grooming assistant, carefully brushing her coat while maintaining a steady stream of chatter about kindergarten and superheroes and whether donkeys had dreams. They're not what I expected, Sarah had said, watching her children integrate seamlessly into the desert family. They're so gentle, so present. They saved me by needing me, Hank replied. Gave me a reason to get up every morning that wasn't about survival, about caring for something other than my own pain. The photo session had been Tom's suggestion. A professional photographer friend who specialized in family portraits was visiting from Phoenix, and the symbolism felt right. 3 generations of humans and 3 rescued donkeys, all of them scarred by various hardships, all of them learning that healing was possible when shared. "This is going on the mantle," Sarah declared as they reviewed the digital images on the photographer's camera, right next to Mom's wedding picture. The 2 most important moments in our family's history. Baby Margaret had slept through most of the desert adventure, waking only to nurse and to gaze with the profound attention that newborns brought to every face they encountered. When Hank held her for the first time, her tiny fingers wrapping around his calloused thumb, he'd understood viscerally what he'd missed with Emily and Jake. The weight of absolute trust. The responsibility and privilege of being someone's safe harbor. "She looks like Mom," Sarah had said, watching him cradle her daughter. "Same stubborn chin. God help us all," Hank had replied, making Sarah laugh with genuine joy. The laughter had come easily during that week, at meals where Jake told elaborate stories about his imaginary friend who rode dinosaurs, during evening walks where Emily collected interesting rocks to add to her growing geology collection. In quiet moments, when Sarah would catch his eye and smile, as if she still couldn't quite believe he was really there. Now, 6 months after their reunion, Hank split his time between 2 worlds. 3 weeks a month in the desert with Grace and her growing family, Buck and Honey were approaching maturity, and there were signs that Grace might be expecting again. 1 week a month in San Diego being Grandpa Hank, learning the rhythms of soccer practice and bedtime stories and the peculiar negotiations required to convince a 5-year-old that vegetables were not actually poison. The transition wasn't always smooth. Sometimes Emily's questions about Margaret probed wounds that hadn't fully healed. Sometimes Jake's energy overwhelmed Hank's desert-trained nerves. Sometimes Sarah would catch him staring at baby Margaret with an expression that mixed joy with regret for all the moments he'd missed. But the difficult moments were balanced by revelations of grace he'd never expected. Emily teaching him to braid friendship bracelets. Jake insisting that Grandpa Hank was the only one who could properly tuck him in at night. Sarah calling just to share funny things the kids had said, treating him like a real part of their daily lives. The desert had taught him survival. His family was teaching him how to live. Sometimes the smallest acts of kindness really could change everything. A mother donkey trusting a broken man with her children's safety. A daughter choosing forgiveness over resentment. Grandchildren accepting a stranger as family because love, they'd learned, was something you did rather than something you felt. As the sun set over the Mojave, painting the sky in shades of redemption, Hank sat on his porch, watching Grace graze with her foals. Tomorrow, Sarah would call with updates about Emily's science fair project and Jake's latest adventures in kindergarten diplomacy. Next week, he'd drive to San Diego for Margaret's first birthday party. The isolation that had once felt like safety now felt like emptiness waiting to be filled. Connection carried risks, the possibility of loss, disappointment, failure. But it also carried the only thing that made life worth living, the chance to matter to someone other than yourself. Grace lifted her head and looked toward the cabin, her dark eyes reflecting starlight and something that looked remarkably like contentment. Some bonds, once formed, could survive even the worst mistakes. Hank had finally learned what Grace had been trying to teach him from the beginning. Family wasn't something you earned through perfection. It was something you built through presence, maintained through forgiveness, and strengthened through the daily choice to stay. Even when staying was hard, the desert stretched away in all directions, no longer empty but full of possibility.